When my mother called to invite me to her birthday party, I should have known something was off. She wasn't the type to celebrate aging. She barely acknowledged my birthday most years. But this time, her voice was uncharacteristically warm, almost eager. "It's a special occasion, darling," she said. "I want the whole family together. You and Ethan have to come." Ethan, my husband of 6 years, glanced up from his laptop when he heard his name. He raised an eyebrow, and I shrugged. My mother and I had a strained relationship, but she had never been outright cruel to me. Still, something about the way she spoke unsettled me. That feeling only grew when we arrived at my parents' house on the night of the party. The air inside was thick with the scent of too many candles. A large cake sat untouched in the center of the dining table, but no one had gathered around to sing. My mother stood near the fireplace, sipping wine, a satisfied gleam in her eyes as she watched us walk in. "Happy birthday, Mom," I said hesitantly, handing her the gift we had picked out, an expensive perfume she had once admired. She barely glanced at it before setting it aside. "Oh, we'll get to presents later, dear. First, let's have dinner. There's something I need to share with you both." I looked around the room. The usual guests were here, my father, a few aunts and uncles, and my older brother, Daniel, who gave me a fleeting, uneasy smile. I reached for Ethan's hand under the table as we sat down. His fingers curled around mine, offering silent reassurance. I didn't know why, but I felt as though we had just stepped into a trap. Dinner began like any other family gathering, at least on the surface. The table was filled with my mother's best dishes, one she usually reserved for holidays. Roast lamb, buttery mashed potatoes, perfectly seasoned vegetables. It was the kind of effort she never made for just any occasion. Ethan squeezed my hand again, this time in appreciation of the meal. "This is incredible, Mrs. Hale," he said, giving my mother one of his easy, charming smiles. "You really went all out." My mother beamed. "Well, it's a special night." That was the second time she had said that. She lifted her wine glass, tapping a spoon against it delicately. "Before we get too deep into the meal, I'd like to say something." The room fell quiet. She stood, her glass raised, and looked around the table with something close to satisfaction. "For years, our family has held secrets," she began. "Some necessary, some unfortunate." I felt my stomach clench. This was not a normal birthday toast. My father stared at his plate, his jaw tense. My brother Daniel was fidgeting with his fork, looking anywhere but at our mother. "I've decided," my mother continued, "that it's time for honesty. After all, family deserves the truth." Ethan, oblivious to the tension, chuckled softly. "That sounds ominous." But I didn't laugh. Neither did anyone else. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. And yet, I had no idea just how much worse it was about to get. The air in the dining room grew thick with silence. I glanced around the table, searching for a clue, some hint as to what my mother was leading up to. My father wouldn't meet my eyes, his fingers tightening around his glass. My brother, Daniel, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face pale. Whatever this truth was, they already knew. Ethan cleared his throat, offering a light-hearted smile. "Well, now I'm curious. Should I be worried?" My mother's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Oh, Ethan, dear," she said, taking a slow sip of her wine. "This concerns you more than anyone." The unease I'd been feeling turned to ice in my veins. I gripped Ethan's hand under the table, suddenly desperate for reassurance. He gave me a small squeeze, but his expression was confused, his confidence unshaken. "Mom," I said carefully, "what's going on?" She set her wine glass down with an almost theatrical slowness, then looked at me as if she were savoring this moment. "You and Ethan," she said, her voice sickeningly sweet, "share a deeper bond than you realize. A cold shiver crawled up my spine. "What does that mean?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. My mother just tilted her head. "Finish your dinner, dear. We'll get to that soon." The room felt suffocating. The candlelight flickered, casting long, ghostly shadows across the table. I had never been more afraid to hear the truth. And yet, I had no choice but to wait. The rest of dinner passed in unbearable tension. Every bite of food felt like sand in my mouth. The conversation at the table was hollow, half-hearted attempts at normalcy that quickly fizzled into silence. Ethan, ever the optimist, tried to lighten the mood. "This lamb is incredible," he said, flashing his usual charming grin. "Laura's always told me her mom was a great cook, but this really proves it." My mother merely gave him a knowing look, her smile unfaltering. "Oh, Ethan," she murmured, "you have no idea how much I've done for this family." I barely heard them. My heart was pounding in my ears. Daniel, sitting across from me, finally lifted his head. His expression was tight, his grip on his fork so firm his knuckles had turned white. When our eyes met, he gave me the smallest shake of his head. A warning. Don't ask. Don't push. But I couldn't ignore the dread curling in my stomach. I turned to my father. "Dad?" I whispered, just loud enough for him to hear. "What is she talking about?" His entire body stiffened, and for a moment, I thought he might actually speak up. But then my mother's gaze landed on him, sharp, expectant. And he looked down. I felt something inside me crack. "I think we should leave," I whispered to Ethan, my fingers curling into a fist in my lap. "Something's wrong." Ethan frowned, confused by my sudden urgency. "Laura, it's just a dinner. Your mom's being dramatic, that's all." But I knew better. And when my mother stood, clinking her spoon against her glass once more, I knew we weren't leaving. "Not yet." "All right, everyone," she said smoothly. "Shall we move to the living room? I have something to share." A chill ran down my spine. This was it. The moment everything would change. The living room was warm, but I felt cold. I sat stiffly on the couch, Ethan beside me, his hand resting on my knee in a silent attempt to calm me. Across the room, my mother took her time settling into her favorite chair, savoring the anticipation like a performer waiting for the curtain to rise. My father stood by the fireplace, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Daniel had chosen a spot near the window, his posture tense, as if he wanted to bolt at any moment. The entire room felt wrong. Ethan let out a nervous chuckle. "All right, Mrs. Hale, you've got us on the edge of our seats. What's this big secret?" My mother's gaze flickered to me, and the way she looked at me made my skin crawl. "I suppose," she said, "it's time I tell you both the truth about your marriage." I stiffened. "What?" She exhaled slowly, dramatically. "I never wanted to tell you. I thought it was for the best that certain things remain buried. But as I get older, I realize the weight of secrets." Ethan shifted beside me, his brows drawn together. "What are you talking about?" My mother smiled, but there was no joy in it. "I suppose I should start at the beginning." She took a slow sip of her wine, letting the suspense stretch. And then she said something that made my stomach drop. "The man you know as your father, Laura, is not your biological father." The room fell silent. I blinked. The words didn't make sense at first, didn't seem to register. "What?" I whispered. My mother sighed, her voice taking on an almost wistful tone. "I was young, reckless. There was someone else before your father, a man I loved deeply, but it wasn't meant to be. When I married your father, I was already pregnant with you." I stared at her, my throat tightening. "You mean Dad isn't my real father?" My father, no, the man I had called my father my whole life, looked away, his jaw clenched. He had known. My chest felt tight, but Ethan's hand in mine kept me grounded. I turned to him, searching for some kind of reassurance. But my mother wasn't done. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze settling on Ethan now. And neither is his. For a moment, the room was deathly silent. Ethan stiffened beside me. "I'm sorry. What?" he asked, his voice suddenly quieter. My mother set her wine glass down with deliberate care. "You heard me, dear." She looked at him the way a teacher might look at a student struggling to grasp a simple concept. "The man who raised you, who you call your father, is not your biological father either." I felt dizzy. The world around me tilted slightly. I turned to Ethan, but he looked just as stunned as I felt. "That doesn't make any sense," I said, my voice shaky. "What are you trying to say?" My mother's smile didn't waver. If anything, she looked pleased with herself. "What I'm saying, Laura, is that you and Ethan share the same biological father." The words hit me like a physical blow. I forgot how to breathe. The room blurred at the edges, my heartbeat roaring in my ears. I turned to Ethan, my lips parting to speak, but no words came. He looked just as pale, just as lost, his blue eyes locked on my mother in disbelief. Daniel suddenly stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Mom, stop," he snapped, his voice shaking. But she ignored him. "I know it's a shock," she continued, almost soothingly, "but it's the truth." "No." My voice came out barely above a whisper. "That's not possible." My mother sighed, as if my denial was simply an inconvenience. "It is. You and Ethan are half-siblings." The room spun. I gripped the edge of the couch, my fingers digging into the fabric. Ethan let out a choked breath beside me. "No. No. That can't be true." But my mother was watching us with a knowing look, waiting for the reality of it to sink in. And as much as I wanted to scream that she was lying, I could see it in my father's averted gaze. She wasn't lying. She had invited us here to destroy us. The world around me seemed to shrink. The air in the room was suddenly too thick, the walls pressing in, my mother's words echoing in my head like a cruel, endless refrain. "You and Ethan are half-siblings." "No," I whispered again, shaking my head. "That's not true. It can't be true." Ethan was frozen beside me, his entire body tense. This is some kind of sick joke, right?" he asked, his voice raw, almost pleading. My mother merely tilted her head, as if amused by our disbelief. "I wouldn't joke about something like this." I turned to my father, the man who had raised me, the man I had believed to be my real father my entire life. His eyes were locked on the floor, his hands clenched into fists. He still wouldn't look at me. "Dad?" My voice cracked. "Say something. Tell me this isn't true." He inhaled sharply but said nothing. I felt my stomach lurch. The silence was worse than if he had confirmed it outright. I couldn't breathe. I shot up from the couch, nearly stumbling as I backed away. No, I don't believe it." "Laura," my mother said in that same maddeningly calm voice, as if I were being unreasonable. "I know this is hard to hear, but the truth always comes out eventually. And it's better that you know now rather than later." "Later? Later?" I wanted to scream. "We've been married for 6 years. How much later did you want it to be?" Ethan pushed himself up, his breathing uneven. "If this is true," he said, his voice shaking, "then that means, all this time, He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. A nauseating wave of realization crashed over me. I gripped my stomach, my legs threatening to give out. "How could you keep this from us?" I managed to choke out, looking at my mother, then my father, then my brother, who still stood by the window, his hands in his hair, looking just as horrified as I felt. My mother sighed, as if exhausted by my reaction. "Because it didn't matter before." "Didn't matter?" My blood ran cold. Ethan's hands balled into fists. didn't matter? His voice was rising now, laced with a fury I had never heard from him before. We've been married for 6 years. He stopped himself, pressing his hands to his face. I could barely stand. I needed to get out. I needed air. I turned on my heel and bolted toward the door. Laura, wait! Ethan called after me, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I just needed to escape. I stumbled into the cold night air, gasping like I had been drowning. The sky stretched dark and endless above me, but I could barely see past the blur of tears clouding my vision. Behind me, I heard the door swing open. Footsteps followed, quick, urgent. Laura, wait! Ethan's voice. I kept walking, my heels clicking unevenly against the pavement. My pulse was hammering in my ears, my mind still reeling from the revelation that had just shattered my entire existence. I felt Ethan's hand wrap gently around my wrist, stopping me. Laura, please! His voice was strained, desperate. I turned to face him, and for the first time, I saw the full weight of the horror in his eyes. This can't be real, I whispered, my throat raw. It can't be! Ethan's grip on my wrist loosened, then fell away completely. He ran a shaking hand through his hair. I don't even know what to think right now. His voice cracked. How could they do this to us? I let out a hollow, breathless laugh. They knew. All this time they knew. Ethan turned away, hands on his hips, staring at the ground like if he looked at me too long, the truth would become even more unbearable. And maybe it would. I felt like I might throw up. My stomach twisted violently at every memory that came rushing back. Our wedding, our first home, every kiss, every moment of tenderness, all of it now tainted by something unspeakable. What do we do? Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. Because no matter what we did, there was no undoing this. Ethan and I stood there in the cold, both of us too stunned to move, too horrified to process what we had just learned. His breathing was uneven, his hands shaking slightly at his sides. I knew because mine were the same. We have to get confirmation, I said suddenly, the thought forcing itself through my swirling panic. My voice was tight, raw. There has to be a way to prove she's lying. Ethan turned to me, his expression unreadable. And what if she's not lying? I flinched at the words. I didn't want to consider that possibility. If I did, it would make everything too real. I don't know, I admitted. But we can't just accept this. Ethan dragged a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. A DNA test, he murmured. That's the only way to know for sure. The idea sent a fresh wave of nausea through me, but I nodded. It was the only logical step. But then another thought hit me, one that nearly buckled my knees. Ethan. My voice wavered. What if she wanted this to happen? He frowned. What do you mean? I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. She invited us here for a reason. She waited until we were already married before saying anything. Why now? Why tell us like this? Ethan's jaw tightened. I could see the gears turning in his head, the way his mind was trying to piece together the same awful question I had. It didn't make sense. Unless my mother wanted to destroy us. Unless she enjoyed watching the devastation unfold. I turned back toward the house, my blood running cold as I stared at the glowing windows. The people inside, my so-called family, were sitting comfortably, knowing the bomb they had just dropped on us. And I suddenly realized I needed more than just answers. I needed to know why. I turned sharply on my heel and marched back toward the house, my heart hammering so hard I could barely hear my own footsteps. Laura, wait! Ethan grabbed my arm, but I shook him off. No, I snapped. She doesn't get to ruin our lives and then sit back like it's nothing. I need to hear why. I yanked open the front door so hard it banged against the wall. The living room was exactly as we had left it, warm, quiet, unbearably normal. My mother sat with her wine, her expression unreadable. My father stood by the fireplace, still staring at the floor. Daniel looked sick. I stepped into the room, my hands clenched into fists. "Why?" My mother sighed and placed her glass down delicately. "Laura, darling, I know this is difficult." "No." My voice came out sharp, shaking. "You knew. You knew before we got married. You knew for years. And you said nothing." Ethan followed behind me, his presence solid and tense. "You waited until now to tell us," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Why?" My mother studied us both, then exhaled, shaking her head as if we were the ones being unreasonable. "Because I thought it would be better this way." My stomach turned. "Better?" I choked out. "Better? You let us—" I stopped myself before I could finish the sentence. She tilted her head, as if choosing her words carefully. "Would it really have changed anything?" I stared at her, horrified. "It would have changed everything." She gave a slow, deliberate shrug. "You were in love. You were happy. I didn't want to take that away from you." Ethan let out a bitter, disbelieving laugh. "You didn't want to take it away from us? What do you think you just did?" I looked at my father, my voice cracking. "And you knew? All this time?" His face twisted with guilt, but he still couldn't meet my eyes. "I found out after you were born," he admitted quietly. "But it didn't change anything for me. You were my daughter. You are my daughter." His words rang hollow. Daniel suddenly stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "She wanted this," he muttered, his hands running through his hair. "She wanted this to happen." A shiver ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked slowly. Daniel shot our mother a glare, his face tight with barely restrained anger. "You think this was an accident? You think she just happened to wait until now to tell you?" He scoffed. "She's been planning this for years." My mother's expression didn't change. I felt my blood run cold. "Why?" My voice came out small, barely above a whisper. My mother smiled. "Because, darling," she said simply, "I wanted to see what you would do." My mother's words hung in the air like poison, seeping into every corner of my mind. I wanted to see what you would do. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I could barely process the sheer cruelty of what she was saying. Ethan was the first to break the silence. This was some kind of test to you?" His voice was hoarse, disbelieving. She picked up her wine glass again, swirling the liquid with practiced ease. "Not a test, dear. An experiment." I felt like I was going to be sick. "You're lying," I whispered. You're trying to manipulate us. You enjoy this, don't you?" Her expression softened, as if she were speaking to a child who simply didn't understand. "Laura, don't be so dramatic." Dramatic? My whole world was collapsing around me, and she had the audacity to call me dramatic. I turned to my father, hoping, praying, for some kind of contradiction, some hint that this wasn't true. But his face told me everything. He had known. Maybe not about her intentions, but he had known the secret she had been hiding all these years. And he had let it fester, had let it grow into this nightmare. Daniel, still standing by the window, let out a humorless laugh. "You really don't get it, do you?" He turned to Ethan and me, shaking his head. "She loves watching people squirm. She loves having power over people, knowing she can control them with just a few words." "Daniel," my mother said coolly, setting down her wine glass, "you've always been so bitter." He scoffed. "Gee, I wonder why." I could barely focus on their exchange. My mind was spinning, my body trembling. "Why tell us now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why wait until we were married?" My mother's lips curled into something that was almost a smile. "Because I wanted to see how strong your love really was." Ethan inhaled sharply beside me. You knew this would destroy us. She gave a slow, deliberate shrug. Did I? My vision blurred with tears. My hands clenched at my sides. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake her. I wanted to hurt her the way she had just hurt me. But instead, I whispered, You're a monster. She just smiled. Because she had already won. The room was suffocating. Ethan stood rigid beside me, his breath uneven. My father still wouldn't look at me. Daniel's fists were clenched at his sides, his expression dark with barely restrained fury. And my mother, the woman who raised me, just sat there, smiling like she had orchestrated the perfect show. You wanted to see how strong our love was? Ethan's voice was hoarse. What kind of sick reasoning is that? My mother leaned forward slightly, studying us as if we were pieces in a game she had been playing for years. Love is an illusion, she said softly. People think it's unbreakable, but in the end, it bends to reality. I simply removed the illusion. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. So that's it? I whispered. You did this just to watch us fall apart? She sighed, as if I was exhausting her. I did this because I believe truth should always come to light. Whether you choose to embrace it or let it destroy you, well, that's entirely up to you. My breath hitched. The weight of her words pressed down on me, suffocating, unbearable. Ethan took a step back. His hands were shaking. I need to get out of here. His voice cracked. I turned to him, panic flaring in my chest. Ethan, wait! But he was already moving, already headed for the door. He looked at me once, his expression unreadable, and then he was gone. The sound of the door closing behind him was deafening. I stood there, frozen, staring at the empty space where he had just been. Daniel exhaled sharply, breaking the silence. You enjoyed that, didn't you? He muttered, glaring at our mother. She gave him a serene look. I suppose we'll see how this plays out. Something inside me snapped. I turned and stormed out the door, not even stopping to grab my coat. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I barely felt it. My heart pounded as I looked around frantically, searching for Ethan. He was standing by the car, his hands braced against the hood, his shoulders rising and falling unevenly. I swallowed hard and stepped toward him. Ethan. He didn't look up. I don't know how to process this. His voice was hollow. I don't know what to do. Neither did I. Because no matter which way we looked at it, our lives would never be the same again. Ethan stood motionless, his hands still pressed against the cold metal of the car. His breathing was uneven, and when he finally lifted his head to look at me, I barely recognized the expression in his eyes. It wasn't just shock. It wasn't just pain. It was the slow realization that we had been living in a lie, one so cruel and deliberate that it had poisoned everything we had built together. We need to take the test, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. We need proof. Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. And what if it comes back positive? He looked at me then, truly looked at me, and my stomach twisted at the torment in his eyes. What then, Laura? I opened my mouth, but no words came. Because the truth was, I didn't know. If my mother was telling the truth, if Ethan and I were truly connected by blood, then every memory, every promise, every moment we had shared was now tainted with something unspeakable. But if she was lying, if this was all part of some twisted manipulation, then what? Could we ever go back to how we were before? Would we ever be able to look at each other the same way again? Ethan let out a bitter laugh. This is insane! We've been together for 6 years, Laura. Married. Thinking about kids. And now, in one night, it's all. He stopped, his voice breaking. I stepped forward hesitantly. We don't know yet. We can't let her win, Ethan. He let out a slow, shaking breath, then nodded. Fine. We take the test. A beat of silence passed between us, heavy with the weight of the unknown. And for the first time since my mother had spoken those horrifying words, I realized that no matter what the results said, we might never be the same again. The days that followed were unbearable. Ethan and I barely spoke as we waited for the test results. We stayed in the same house, yet it felt like we were miles apart. Every glance, every accidental touch, was laced with uncertainty. I caught myself staring at old wedding photos more than once, searching for something, some reassurance that what we had was real, that it still could be. But the doubt was always there, lurking beneath the surface. When the results finally arrived, my hands trembled as I opened the envelope. Ethan stood across from me, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw clenched. I unfolded the paper, scanning the words until I found the one sentence that decided everything. Probability of siblingship, 0%. A sharp breath left my lips. I read it twice. 3 times. Ethan, I whispered, looking up at him, my heart pounding. She lied. His eyes darkened, his whole body going rigid. Are you sure? I turned the paper toward him, and as his eyes landed on the words, his breath hitched. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he exhaled, pressing his hands against his face. A shaky laugh left his lips, half relief, half disbelief. She lied, he repeated, as if saying it out loud would make it more real. A fresh wave of emotion crashed over me. Rage, betrayal, exhaustion. She did this on purpose, I whispered. She wanted to break us. Ethan lowered his hands, his expression unreadable. And she almost did. We stood there in silence, both of us absorbing the weight of what had just happened. Then Ethan reached for me. For the first time in days, I didn't hesitate. I stepped into his arms, burying my face against his shoulder, as the last of my fear melted away. We're okay, he murmured into my hair, holding me tightly. We're okay. But deep down, I knew that wasn't entirely true. Because my mother's deception had left a scar, one that wouldn't fade easily. And as much as I wanted to put this behind us, I knew one thing for certain. I would never forgive her. And I would never let her hurt me again.